October 20th, 1944. The invasion force off Leyte put its first wave ashore and established a strip behind the beach that could handle light aircraft. The small Liaison planes, Piper L-4s, and Stinson L-5s, OY-1 in Marine Corps service, were assigned to artillery regiments and division fire direction centers to correct fire on targets that ground observers could not see through cane, mangrove, and broken terrain. Their job description was functional rather than glamorous. Lift off in a few dozen yards, orbit above the front at low speed, locate hostile mortars and field guns by flash, smoke, or dust, translate those observations into map coordinates, and walk rounds onto the position until it was neutralized. The airplanes were unarmored and unarmed. Their value came from the fact that a steady voice on the net could shorten the time from first round to effective fire and reduce ammunition expenditure by eliminating guesswork. The pilots were usually artillery officers trained to fly basic liaison types. They worked from hand-drawn overlays and gridded 120,000 or 150,000 maps marked with phase lines and known points. A standard call would identify a grid square, an estimated target description, single tube, cave aperture, probable 75 mm, or harassing mortar cluster, and a request for 1 round HE, adjust. Corrections followed in short clipped phrases, add, drop, left, right, each measured against visible bursts and the relationship to the target feature. Once the sheaf bracketed the objective, the air observer called fire for effect, then remained overhead to confirm results or re-attack if the position revived. This technique, routine in Europe, had particular importance in the Philippines and the Ryukyus, where vegetation and broken coral hid gun crews that had excellent camouflage discipline. In that environment, the difference between a suspected position and a destroyed position was often a liaison plane's ability to see into folds of ground unavailable to observers on ridges or in palm groves. On Leyte, the little aircraft dealt with two simultaneous problems. First, the island's interior, crisscrossed with rivers and terraces, limited ground observation to very short distances. Second, the Japanese recognized the plane's value and attempted to blind the artillery by attacking the strips that housed them. In early December, enemy troops struck the Brodie airfield complex as part of a wider airborne and ground effort to disrupt American lodgments. The attacks were serious enough to threaten aircraft and fuel at Brodie, but they did not eliminate the capability. Liaison sections dispersed their aircraft, flew as soon as daylight allowed, and were back over the front correcting fire on the same batteries that had supported the night's infiltration. Contemporary U.S. Army histories record the Brodie assaults and the steps taken to hold the airstrips. Those same narratives emphasize how essential air observation remained for counter-battery work once the perimeter stabilized. Ibiblio Plush 1. By January 1945, the campaign had shifted north to Luzon. Landings in Lingayen Gulf opened approaches into the Central Plain and the mountain trails beyond. The Verde Trail in particular, narrow, steep, and subject to enfilade from cave positions, illustrated the liaison plane's role in a protracted fight. Infantry reports noted that a gun could fire a short, regular program from a concealed slope and then go quiet. Without aerial adjustment, counter-battery often fell on empty rock or secondary dummy ports. With an L-4 or OY-1 orbiting above a draw or saddle, corrections tightened quickly. Liaison pilots learned to look for minute signatures: a dark seam that did not match the slope's texture, a small rectangle of scraped earth near a tomb, the sudden fringe of dust indicating a recoil. They developed habits designed to stay alive under small arms, fire-changing altitude bands, irregular orbits, and never holding a course against a fixed background. Their survival depended on movement and on not becoming predictable to riflemen watching their pattern. The aircraft themselves were well suited to the job. The L-4, a military Cub, combined low stall speed with excellent short-field performance and visibility. The Stinson L-5 OY-1 added a stronger airframe, greater payload, and the ability to carry a second crew member or a litter, which made it valuable for casualty evacuation on return legs. Both types could operate from improvised strips cane fields, sections of road, or small coral clearings, kept serviceable by a handful of mechanics and a supply trailer. They were designed to be maintained in the field with minimal tools, and they tolerated the dust and humidity that defeated more complex equipment. Published technical and operational summaries stress their use for artillery spotting, message transport, and emergency evacuation, and note the L-5's exclusive military design lineage in contrast to the L-4's civilian origins. Wikipedia on Iwo Jima. In February 1945, the Marine Corps' observation squadrons took the Liaison concept into one of the most confined and heavily fortified battles of the war. Because no friendly airfield existed ashore during the opening days, the Navy equipped LST-776 with the Brodie landing or launch system, an overhead cable rig that allowed light aircraft to hook into the wire for recovery and to be slung off for launch. Additional OY-1s were ferried in escort carriers and brought forward as the beachhead expanded. Official Marine and Navy accounts describe this arrangement in matter-of-fact terms. 20 OY aircraft assigned, several staged from 7 escort carriers, 6 loaded in LST-776, 2 successfully launched by the Brodie device from each of 2 divisions, 1 plane lost overboard during recovery, a risk inherent in sea state and ship motion. Once ashore, OY-1s orbited along the Motoyama Plateau and the slopes of Suribachi to adjust both Corps artillery and naval gunfire into cave mouths and reverse-slope gun ports. The squadron's routine after the first strip was secured was simple. Fly whenever wind and sealing permitted, adjust fire on any position impeding infantry or armor, and confirm effects under the same low cloud and volcanic dust that obscured ground observation. Contemporary Marine squadron histories and U.S. Navy narrative studies underline the quiet efficiency of this work and the extraordinary improvisation required to fly such aircraft at all before an airstrip existed. Военно-морская история +2, и Библия +2. The correction sequence on Iwo followed the same pattern refined in the Philippines. A pilot or observer would identify a likely aperture on the cliff face or a wash of smoke inconsistent with the wind, request a single round from a ship or a 105mm battery, and then correct based on the fall of shot. Because many Japanese positions were built deep into rock with small ports, delay fuses and heavy shells were preferred when available. Reports describe cave mouths being sealed by repeated impacts, with liaison aircraft remaining overhead long enough to ensure that secondary ports did not open, or that the position did not resume fire after the first lull. This patient verification, staying on station, to confirm a result, rather than assuming it was one reason ground units came to trust the Grasshoppers despite their vulnerability. Okinawa, in April-June 1945, extended the model to a larger battlefield and worse weather. The island's southern half was a fortress of tombs, coral ridges, and layered positions tied together by communication trenches and reinforced caves along the Shuri line. Marine and Army artillery units fired at rates unmatched elsewhere in the Pacific, and liaison aircraft were kept in the air whenever sealing allowed. A frequent pattern emerged. Infantry identified a general sector from which mortars or artillery fired. A liaison plane found the specific fold producing the rounds. The Fire Direction Center shifted priority to counter-battery. The air observer refined corrections until the flashes stopped. The aircraft then stayed long enough to determine whether the enemy crew was waiting out the pattern. Marine Corps narratives of the operation emphasize both the unprecedented volume of artillery and the constant requirement for aerial adjustment to keep ammunition economy and tempo aligned with the ground commander's schedule. Nationalna Sluzhba Parkov, США. By this stage of the war, doctrine recognized two complementary roles for aviation in support of the ground scheme of maneuver. Fighter bombers and medium bombers struck area targets and interdicted movement, using forward air control when available. Liaison aircraft provided precise, continuous adjustment for indirect fire systems, particularly against point targets like single guns, mortars, and machine gun nests, whose exact locations could be determined in relation to fixed terrain features. The equipment reflected these roles. L-4s typically carried a VHF set for artillery nets and sometimes an additional set for air-ground coordination. OY-1s added performance margins and the option to carry an observer with a separate map board. Neither had armor, both relied on small size, low speed, and constant movement to reduce exposure. Training focused on gunnery geometry, map reading, and radio discipline. Pilots learned to compute quick range and deflection corrections by eye and to anticipate how wind drift and terrain masking would affect observation. Casualty evacuation became an important secondary role once strips existed near the front. The OY-1's cabin could be configured to accept a litter, and short hops from forward strips to field hospitals saved hours of overland movement across rutted trails. Museum collections and squadron recollections preserve examples of Marine OY-1s that carried out such missions during the Okinawa campaign, where the overall weight of artillery and small arms fire made rapid evacuation valuable for survival even before surgery. This air ambulance function had no bearing on counter-battery directly, but it reinforced the aircraft's reputation among ground troops and ensured that liaison sections were protected and supplied. The American Heritage Museum, in routine practice, survival for liaison aircraft depended on humility and procedure. Pilots avoided straight-line passes that allowed riflemen to establish lead. They altered altitudes and orbits irregularly. They crossed suspected small arms concentrations with extra airspeed and used terrain to break lines of sight. They treated each visible burst with skepticism until repeated observations confirmed a pattern. They learned to call cease rather than effect when smoke or grass fires created false impressions of success, conserving ammunition for verified targets. The design of the L-4 and OY-1 enabled this cautious persistence. A slow stall, tight turning radius, and excellent low-speed handling allowed an aircraft to remain over a small box of terrain long enough to gather the data a fire direction center needed. The Japanese adapted with their own practical methods. They camouflaged ports with nets and painted light into shadows to defeat aerial spotting. They fired on short programs and shifted tubes to alternate positions, counting on delays in correction to survive. They aimed small arms at fixed skyline points on probable ovals where a liaison plane might appear. In areas with favorable terrain, they attempted to ambush strips with mortar fire or infiltrate to destroy aircraft on the ground. Even so, the balance of adaptation favored the side with a functioning artillery air section. A single, competent pilot-observer team could render a whole sector safer by neutralizing the handful of guns that troubled it most persistently. The organizational framework matured as the campaigns progressed. Marine divisions employed observation squadrons, VMO, whose primary mission was artillery spotting and reconnaissance. Army divisions employed liaison sections that reported to division artillery. At Iwo Jima, Marine VMOs flew OY-1s from carriers and LST-776 during the initial phase, then from Motoyama airfields as soon as practicable, receiving unit-level recognition for their role. At other times and places, Army L-4 sections performed the same tasks for corps and division artillery. A short list of key points in official sources: number of OY aircraft staged forward, the use of escort carriers to ferry them, the Brodie system's employment, and the observation squadron's awards, illustrates how institutional the practice had become by 1945. Sentinel Club +2. Военно-морская история +2. The technique itself rested on three repeatable elements. First, finding, learning the signatures of a firing position and its likely locations relative to slope, cover, and lines of communication. Second, fixing, reducing uncertainty by repeated observation, single-round bracketing, and cross-checking with reports from infantry companies or radar counter-battery when available. Third, finishing, applying the correct fuse and caliber, confirming results, and reserving ammunition if the target no longer warranted fire. The best air observers were those who could turn a wide, confusing picture into a straightforward message. Single tube, reverse slope, delay fuse recommended, expect displacement 100 yards north. That discipline made artillery more efficient and more responsive at a time when shipping limitations, weather, and tempo punished waste. Results are easier to describe in aggregate than in anecdote because the work produced silences rather than spectacles. After-action records from Leyte indicate that air-adjusted counter-battery missions increased in number after the early December attempts to disrupt forward airfields, a sign that commanders relied on liaison aircraft to regain control of contested sectors. At Iwo Jima, the combination of naval gunfire and corps artillery, adjusted by OY-1s, sealed cave positions that had blocked infantry for hours. On Okinawa, where Marine artillery battalions fired prodigious totals, liaison planes allowed batteries to mass quickly on newly discovered mortars and to shift fire before enemy crews could resume after a pause. Secondary benefits followed. Reduced fratricide risk by confirming target location from above, better use of scarce heavy ammunition, and improved morale in rifle companies that could sense, even if they did not see, a technical conversation between an engine overhead and the guns behind them. Национальная служба парков США. Because the aircraft were small and simple, improvisation was common. Strips were cut into fields with hand tools and bulldozers, windsocks were made from fabric and scrap, refueling was performed from drums and hand pumps, maintenance consisted of fabric repairs, spark plug changes, and control cable adjustments more than complicated engine work. The same simplicity enabled experiments like the Brodie system. The LST-mounted rig demonstrated that a light airplane could be launched and recovered at sea without a flight deck, extending observation into operations where shore bases did not yet exist. Contemporary photographs and Navy text captions document the rig on LST-776 off Iwo Jima and its mixed record in sea states that made recovery challenging. The method was a niche solution to a specific amphibious problem, but it captured the attitude of the liaison community. Find a way to put eyes where guns needed them. Wikimedia Commons +1. Comparisons with Europe are instructive but limited. In the European theater, armored and infantry divisions also relied on L-4s to adjust fire, and in December 1944, some of those aircraft made decisive contributions under extreme conditions. The Pacific presented different constraints. Strips had to be created from coral, weather shifted rapidly, jungle and volcanic terrain hid targets better, and naval gunfire could be integrated with land artillery in island fights. In both theaters, the underlying logic remained. A small aircraft extends the artilleryman's eye, and a competent air observer turns that extra visibility into fewer shells and faster results. General histories of liaison planes cross theaters to make this point, but the Pacific cases show its starkest form because the ground was so often invisible from the ground. Army history plunge. Critiques existed even then. Some infantry officers worried that low-flying aircraft attracted fire to their sectors. Others argued that aircraft sometimes mistook smoke from brush or struck positions already suppressed. The counter-arguments were practical. Proper radio discipline allowed an air observer to halt missions when evidence was insufficient, request photographs or infantry confirmation before expending heavy ammunition, and prioritize sectors based on the ground commander's intent. Over time, trust accumulated. Units that had been skeptical about grasshoppers recognized that a voice with a map and the habit of staying overhead until the last correction could change the rhythm of a day. From a weapons effects perspective, the liaison plane's greatest contribution was not simply killing individual guns, but compressing the time cycle for counter-battery from detection to effect in environments where dispersion and concealment favored the defender. Before aerial adjustment, a harassing mortar might fire for minutes, while ground observers struggled to fix it. With a spotter in the air, the bracket could be established in 2 or 3 rounds, and the mortar silenced or forced to displace. Against heavier pieces, the gain was similar. Fewer ranging rounds, more deliberate use of delay fuses, better timing against crews trained to sit out barrages. These improvements mattered disproportionately late in the war, when logistics had to support simultaneous operations over great distances and ammunition ships competed for convoy escort and port time. Liaison aviation also connected echelons. Company commanders spoke to battalion mortars, battalion to regiment, regiment to division artillery, division to corps, and, near beaches, corps to naval gunfire. An air observer could sit above that conversation and ensure that the right echelon answered. He could recommend that a company mortar handle a nest instead of demanding regiment's 105s. He could, in the other direction, tell a ground-forward observer that a particular cave needed a ship's 8-inch or 14-inch round with delay. That triage conserved ammunition and matched tools to tasks. Naval and marine historical monographs on Iwo Jima explicitly note the way OY-1s helped knit together supporting arms across services during the days when the beachhead was narrow and every aperture in the rock mattered. Voyenno-Morskaya Storia. Casualty figures for liaison units were not negligible, but they were acceptable to commanders given the effect achieved. Losses came mostly from small arms fire during low ceilings, from operational mishaps on improvised strips, and, early at Iwo from sea state complications during Brodie recoveries. The airplane's slow speed made them survivable when hit. Many returned with fabric torn and struts scarred, repairs accomplished with doped patches and new ribs. When aircraft were lost, replacements could be ferried relatively quickly compared to fighter or bomber assets because the types were light, cheap, and did not require complex ground support. The culture around liaison sections emphasized restraint, competence, and routine. Pilots kept notebooks with grids, call signs, and quick sketches of ridges as they actually appeared from habitual orbits. They briefed infantry commanders face-to-face when possible and debriefed with battery fire direction centers to refine techniques. They practiced calls in calm voices even after long hours. Their habits shaped reputation. It became common for ground units to note, without drama, that Air OP was on station and that harassing fire had diminished within minutes. That understated language is visible in the day logs and unit journals that survive. It reflects both the nature of the work and the way soldiers came to regard it. Technology after the war moved forward, but the principles persisted. Helicopters would take over evacuation, and jet aircraft with forward air controllers would assume much of the real-time strike adjustment in later conflicts. Yet the core artillery problem finding small, concealed, lethal point targets and destroying them economically remained. The liaison pilot's craft became the forward observer's craft with different tools. In that sense, the Pacific Grasshoppers represented a hinge between map and compass gunnery and modern combined arms coordination in which airborne eyes and precise fires are married as a matter of course. Articles written to commemorate the Army Aviation Arm's origins acknowledge that these flivver planes braved turbulence, weather, and small arms fire to keep supplies moving and fire accurate in the Pacific, a theater where low-altitude flying could be physically punishing even when the enemy remained unseen. ArmyAviationMagazine.com. One campaign vignette can stand in for many. On a humid afternoon on Leyte's eastern coastal plain, a liaison pilot circled a shallow valley that had produced intermittent mortar fire for 2 days. Ground observers saw nothing beyond smoke that rose and collapsed without discernible pattern. From 200 meters above the paddy, the pilot identified a discoloration beyond a cemetery wall, perhaps the edge of a temporary cover over a tube. He requested 1 round from a 105 millimeter battery, watched it fall long and right, and corrected. The second round collapsed a small shelter. A third, with a slight left adjustment, produced a visible secondary as stored charges ignited. The pilot remained on station for 10 minutes, long enough to confirm that no second tube had been concealed nearby and that infantry could move across the valley floor. No film recorded the action, no headline described it. The day's log contained 2 lines: air OP adjusted, mortar neutralized, co-advanced. Another example comes from Iwo Jima's terraces. An OY-1 crew saw a brief flicker in a crack above a quarry. They requested a single heavy naval round with delay and adjusted 50 yards back up the slope. The second round produced a jet of smoke from the aperture. The crew called fire for effect and then watched dust from a secondary port farther left, an indicator the position had multiple mouths. They relayed the second port's location, received a short pattern, and then recommended a pause for observation. When no further firing occurred, they declared the position neutralized for the time being and shifted to a neighboring draw where armor reported machine gun fire. The account appears in squadron notes as a sequence of times, grids, and corrections, typical of the prosaic style that characterized liaison records. By June 1945 on Okinawa, air observation had become routine enough that battalions planned movements, assuming a liaison plane would be overhead during critical hours. Weather frequently upset those assumptions. On days when ceiling dropped below safe limits, infantry and artillery relied on ground observers and sound-ranging sets. Harassment and interdiction fire replaced precise counter-battery. When weather improved, liaison planes prioritized the sectors that had suffered most normally the approaches to ridges that anchored the Shuri line. Artillery logs show sequences in which batteries shifted quickly from preparation fires to counter-battery under air adjustment as soon as an aircraft reported a muzzle flash. The synchronization saved attackers time and casualties by suppressing positions that habitually pinned companies in draws. When plotted across campaigns, a few trends stand out. First, the liaison system reduced average time to counter-battery effect. Second, it decreased the number of ranging rounds required to secure a kill or neutralization, measurable in ammunition accounting. Third, it improved coordination among supporting arms during amphibious operations where naval gunfire, corps artillery, and battalion mortars could all bear on the same square kilometer. Finally, it furnished a repeatable method for dealing with concealed point targets in complex terrain 1 that ground commanders could plan around. These outcomes explain why, by war's end, few officers dismissed the grasshoppers as novelties. A brief note on nomenclature and service practice clarifies the record. The U.S. Army Air Forces and Army Ground Forces generally designated the Stinson as L-5 and the Piper as L-4. The Marine Corps, operating similar Stinsons, used the designation OY-1. Production timelines for the L-5, its exclusively military lineage, and its distribution to liaison squadrons appear in standard aircraft references. Those same references record the airplane's presence in the Philippines, New Guinea, and the Marianas Volcano Islands in 1944–45. The OY-1s, flown by Marine observation squadrons at Iwo, came forward by escort carrier and LST-776, as Navy sources and Marine monographs agree. The figure 20 OY and the note regarding one aircraft lost overboard during Brodie operations appear in those official narratives. Wikipedia +2. Военно-морская история +2. After the war, liaison veterans summarized their experience in interviews and articles. One Piper L-4 pilot's recollections, representative of many, emphasized the simplicity of training, the sudden responsibility of issuing corrections with a battery waiting, and the physical strain of flying slow in rough air while maintaining orientation over a map. These accounts also note the constant improvisation required to keep the aircraft serviceable and to find landing areas close enough to matter. Where possible, pilots preferred strips within a mile or two of the front to minimize transit time and maximize time on station, with fuel margins conservative enough to handle weather changes. Military Aviation Chronicles. By the time formal hostilities ended, the liaison community had established a practice that would echo in later doctrine. Small, persistent airborne observers extending the reach and precision of ground fires. Their tools would change better radios, new airframes, eventually helicopters and drones, but the underlying logic would not. The Pacific campaigns had offered a set of technical problems: concealment in jungle and rock, rapidly improvised bases, integration with naval fire support that forced solutions. Among those solutions, the steady presence of an L-4 or OY-1 above a contested ridge proved to be one of the most cost-effective ways to make hostile batteries fall silent. The pilots and observers who flew the missions tended not to romanticize them. Their language remained procedural: grid, splash, adjust, effect. Their logs were lean, their claims conservative. What praise exists often came from other branches. Riflemen remembered that counter-battery came faster when a liaison plane was overhead. Gunners remembered that their ammunition went further. Naval officers remembered that small aircraft could keep their heavy shells honest in terrain that offered few reliable ground references. Official publications closed the loop by institutionalizing the lessons, assigning observation squadrons to divisions, formalizing training, and recording in concise paragraphs the facts that future staffs would use. The story begins on a morning like Leyte's and proceeds through Luzon's mountains, Iwo's black terraces, and Okinawa's rain, but it can be told without theatrics. A small aircraft went up, found a hostile gun, and spoke numbers until the gun no longer mattered. That sequence repeated hundreds of times. Where dates are useful, they can be marked briefly. October 1944 landings in the central Philippines, the early December Buri attacks that failed to blind the artillery. February 1945, when OY-1s flew from carriers and an LST rigged with an overhead cable. April-June 1945 on Okinawa, where the volume of fire demanded constant aerial adjustment. The rest is procedure and habit. If one seeks a conclusion, it is simpler than it first appears. The grasshoppers were laughed at until practice erased the joke. The airplane's strength lay in turning observation into corrections, and corrections into silences measured not in headlines, but in the absence of incoming rounds on company positions. Archival summaries, Army and Marine, Navy, and contemporary aviation histories are consistent on this point. When heavy guns spoke in the Pacific with unusual accuracy against targets that refused to show themselves, it was often because a very small aircraft had circled above the ground, read the folds correctly, and kept speaking until the problem stopped making noise.